When I was first contacted by the organizer of this great conference, as I since learned, about the topic of my talk, I was told that it'd be good if I can give the participant of the conference some historical perspectives on who the Chinese are and the way they got, and how they got that way. In 30 minutes. And I'm being timed. I said to myself, well, that's a challenge. So where do I start? And then I look at the title and the description of the conference, and they say China on world stage, which I take it as a reference to the rising power and increasing important role of China in contemporary world since 1979, but particularly perhaps for the last 15 years. And that prompted me to think, maybe as a historian, I should think a little bit about the relationship of China and the world historically, and try to see how that might help us to understand China today. So mostly that was what I would try to talk about this morning. Before I start on that, as a Savoy Way of Entry to that, I want to make a quick observation. Americans, at least many Americans, seem to be always fascinated by China. I was told that the tickets for this conference were sold out very, very quickly. At the one end of the spectrum, I think there's a kind of wonderment. I'm always even tempted to say the word romance with this kind of this large, far-away country with this long and very different history. So on one spectrum, I think that's the kind of fascination. On the other end of the spectrum is a kind of version of the, if I might say that it's the yellow peril. China as a danger, as a threat. But whatever it is, China always, it seems, historically, then as now, seems to be always on American mind. And I wonder that there's certain underlying current maybe to this fascination, maybe a persistent belief that there's some kind of mystery about China, that somehow things don't quite work the same way over there. And I think that, well, I wonder there's still maybe the legacy, to me at least, one of the most commonly held historical misconceptions about China. And by historical misconception, I mean this, that China was once a closed country all unto itself, and it only started engaging the world in the 19th century when Europeans and Americans came knocking on its door. That conception, despite a generation of scholarship to the contrary, seems to still have currency today, at least in the popular imagination. I still hear occasional claims that, well, the recent opening of China is the very first time that China engaged the world, which seemed to me to be a bit astonishing for me as a historian to hear. I think the misconception perhaps is fueled by two different powerful but different forces. On the one hand, many people in the West, Europeans and Americans, like to give the credit that for Europe and America to drag China, kicking and screaming maybe, but into the modern world. That was what we did. We got China into the modern world. Ironically, the Chinese themselves, or at least segment of the Chinese intelligentsia, I would say, or the Chinese government, also reinforce that view because they like to, oftentimes, consciously or subconsciously, overtly or covertly, blame a lot of the problems of China today on the imperialism of the West of the 19th century. So they too reinforce that view that somehow things started kind of there. And in this view, China was just a kind of a peaceful country, merrily minding its own business until Europeans and Americans and later the Japanese came knocking on the door and imposed upon China all the injustices of imperialism. Like all generalizations, these are not necessarily wrong, but they are very misleading, and I think it gives a very skewed understanding of China. Historically, I would simply suggest that for better or for worse, China has actually always engaged the world. The periods in the long history of Chinese history that China actually withdrew itself from engaging from most of the world, at least, maybe obviously most commonly referred to the early decades of the People's Republic, particularly maybe since the 1960s and the 70s, is actually more the exception than the rule. Much has been said about, well, the Chinese are thought of themselves as the Middle Kingdom, how they're uninterested in other places, and so on and so forth. But I would simply point out, if you, for example, look at all the maps and cartography from Islamic civilization, Europe, several centuries ago, they have a tendency to all put themselves in the center of the world. This is how people think. We are all in the center of the world. Just because they think they're in the center of the world doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested in other parts of the world. And the same went with China as well. And to me, rather than looking at China as a closed and historically as a closed and isolated country, it might be best and probably more appropriate to look at the historical formation of China as an empire and to see its history as driven by the logic of pursuit of expansion, characteristics of empire building. Now, before I elaborate on that, let me say immediately, by suggesting China could be understood as an empire, I don't mean to jump into the bandwagon and say that, and to subscribe to the school of thought that, well, China will be a threat to the world, China will be a threat to the US, and so on and so forth. I understand that other speakers, much knowledgeable than I am, will address those very issues. I'll let them analyze that particular question, whether China is a threat in the 20th century and that. What I do mean, however, is that the historical trajectory and behavioral patterns of China is in no ways no better, no worse, no different than many of the other polities and countries, whether we're talking about ancient Rome in ancient time or contemporary United States, for that matter, if you want to stretch the comparison. China, as we know it today, was built and constructed through a history of colonization and expansion. The exact nature of that expansion, of course, is contingent upon time, the geopolitical context, the balance of power, the technology that's available. Europeans began to establish their far-flung colony, as we all know, far away from home several centuries ago. They were engaging in a different kind of expansion, a different kind of empire, but they were not the first empires, of course. Long before the problems of Tibet, Chinese Turkestan, or Xinjiang, or Taiwan, issue that I will return to probably if I have a chance in a moment, raised the possible question of seeing China as an empire. China was actually already well on its way in the thick of empire building. The Chinese even have a very nice term for that process, usually translated into English as Sinification or Sinicization. The term literally means to make things Chinese, to turn them into Chinese. He invokes, of course, parallel to the civilizing mission that always on the lips of Europeans in the last 2 centuries. Like when Europeans talk about the civilizing missions, it sounds pretty good, sounds neutral. It sounds emphasis on cultural influence. It sounds innocuous. What it obscured, what it disguised in Chinese as well as in the European case, was the use of force, violence, and other form of domination to achieve that end, historically. Who knows? As I always like to, in my class of Introduction to Chinese History, who knows? Had the Chinese Tang Army over 1,000 years ago not been defeated by then the emergent Arab forces in near today's Central Asia, in around the middle of the 8th century, if the Tang Army at that point, when they met the Arabs, who were galvanized by the then emergent new religious forces of Islam, had the Tang Army not been defeated and driven back, the part of the world which we call Central West Asia today might still be Buddhist. They might be speaking Chinese. It might sound far-fetched, but this is what empire is all about. Unlike the European power, although there are obviously the obvious differences, unlike European powers who built their colonies in recent centuries on seafaring power, the Chinese was a continental empire and a landed empire. They started 2,000 years ago from what is today's northern China, gradually over time defeated its competitors in the region, absorbed most of the indigenous population into its realm, although, of course, how complete that process of absorption is, even to this day, is very debatable. At the same time, China was historically a maritime power as well, but not a maritime empire. Some of you might, recently probably it's much stuff in the news that whether the Chinese discover America, right? And there's a book on it, 1421. Now there's a map. A map, and not being authenticated as we speak. I'm not going to claim any expertise on the map and all that. What they referred to during that time was probably one of the famous and probably an extraordinary episode in Chinese history. In the beginning of the 15th century, a Muslim eunuch named Zheng He left probably the world's greatest commander at the time around the world. Okay, to give you some sense, just a very brief, I won't go into too much detail of that, just to give you some sense, the first expedition, there are 7 expeditions altogether. The first expedition have 28,000 men on board. There are about 16 large ships, over 200 small ships. How large are the large ships? The large ships are supposedly reach about 400 feet long. Now, what does that mean by 400 feet long? Columbus, Santa Maria was 85 feet long. So they give you a sense of the scale of the Amanda, as it were. That's the argument. Did Zheng He ever reach America? Well, I don't know about that. We can talk about it if you like. But the important thing is that the Amanda came and went. There are all kinds of stories of why the Amanda. Did they were looking for the last emperor who was disposed, or were they looking for what? But the important thing is that, I can have a lot to say more, but the important thing is that they didn't establish permanent colonies the way they came and went. Not that they didn't use violence when they had to. They did. Much of the 28,000 men on board were soldiers. But their point is not to, because the situation, the context is very different. The Amanda came and went. They showed the might of the Ming Empire. They did a few things to reach as far as East Africa or some of it. But they did not establish permanent colonies. Is it because primarily the empire that was China is a landed empire based on interest in expansion over land and interest in its security rather than building colonies overseas? So the problem facing China today, really emerging out of the 19th century, is not that it came out of isolation to join the world. It is a problem of a transition from an empire into a nation. Compounding the problem, perhaps somewhat ironically, is that the Chinese Empire, the last dynastic empire of China, the Qing Dynasty, who ruled China from 1644 to 1911, 1912, was actually a very successful empire. There's a lot of notion that China was weak and crumbling when Europeans, Americans arrived. No, the Qing was actually very successful, a very successful empire. It's actually quite an amazing feat. First of all, it doubled the territories in the country in the 17th and 18th century. Many of the places that you heard about last night, Taiwan, Tibet, Chinese Turkestan, is all incorporated into the realm under the Qing in the 17th and 18th century. It's a fairly recent acquisition, formally acquisition into the Chinese imperial realm by the Qing itself. More amazingly, the rulers of the Qing, as many of you might know, the Manchus, were themselves not the so-called ethnic Han Chinese. They conquered the country in the middle of the 17th century with only about maybe 1 to 2 million people. At that point, there's only 1 to 2 million people on earth who would consider themselves Manchus. And they conquer a country which, by some recent estimate in the middle of the 7th century, have a population maybe as big as over 200 million. So this is impressive feat by any standard. And on top of that, as I mentioned, it doubled the territory. So this impressive empire building. Drawing on their own historical experience, the Manchus, being on the margin, if you will, of historic Chinese empire, they managed a large chunk of outlying territories, the Muslim Northwest, for example, by employing an array of tactics, ranging from recognizing local customs, local social structure, power structure, even recognizing multiple jurisdictions, on the one hand, to another hand, by encouraging colonization through settlement, exploring arable land, and so on. So there's a history, if you will, that way back to how to manage the empire, that way. At the same time, the Manchus, even way before they really deal with the Europeans, are very aware of the outside powers. In the 18th century, they negotiated, they signed treaties with them, what they perceived to be the most important competitor for them in the north, the emerging power of Russia. In the south, they dealt with the Europeans that appear in using familiar tactics that they have of empire management, not shutting the door. They never really shut the door, but they regulate it, they manage it, as it were. Indeed, through much of the 18th century, the Qing looked like a fairly well-governed, prosperous empire. So when the Europeans came, it's not to drag China out of the isolation. It's a confrontation between two different empires, two different forms of empires. The Europeans, of course, were driven by their growing industrial technology and military might, fueled by the insatiable need for resources, raw materials, markets, and consumers to keep the economic engine, that then rather new economic engine churning. And China, then with 500 million people, now with 1.3 billion people, is always a tempting target for that process. For the Chinese themselves, the challenge is how to turn this far-flung multi-ethnic empire by that point, really, into a machinery, into a body that can generate, if you will, resources, to able to deal with this new challenge, if you will. But at the same time, and that's this important point here, to also hold on to the empire. Managing the empire no longer really means, to hold on to the empire, as the Qing quickly find out, no longer mean the old style of management. Make sure people have enough things to eat, make sure they have to be clothed at least most of the time, dealing with natural disaster like famines and flooding, regular trade, both domestic or external. It demands much more now. It demanded the centralization and mobilization of human and material resources to a degree unparalleled in Chinese history, simply to generate even more resources. But at the same time, despite all of this, China has never given up or reduced the hold of its empire, despite all the problems that it presented, despite the fact that some of these people in the empire might not even want to belong to the empire. And from the Qing right down to the People's Republic, China has always made the claim, that the imperial reach of the Qing Empire is legitimately defined what the territorial boundaries of the Chinese nation. They have made that claim, surprisingly enough, actually, in some ways, if you look at it historically, surprisingly effectively. Most countries accepted that claim. That yes, the imperial reach of the Qing state is the territorial boundaries of the new nation. They accepted that most of the time, including the United States. That has become the orthodoxy, if you will, dealing with China today. That imperial reach of the empire is the legitimate boundaries of the Chinese nation. It must be said, though, despite all of that, China has never withdrew from the world, and at least most of the time, even despite that difficult transition. One could trace the romance, if you will, between America and China to many different sources. The first Chinese graduate of American college actually graduated from America as early as 1854 from Yale, which still have a very prominent presence in China through many ways. He, in turn, this first graduate of Yale, a Chinese, who in turn led the first group of officially sponsored Chinese students, from the Qing, a familiar sight on American campuses today, Chinese students, who arrived at Hartford, Connecticut in 1872. This group of students actually are very young. They're only maybe about 12 and 15 all told, the 120 of them, they are about 12 to 15 years old. The idea is that they study in America, in Hartford, Connecticut, learn the language and so on, and then enter American, actually military academies, West Point and Annapolis. Then it was called off because the American government would not let them in, as they were. It was called off. They won't let them into West Point. They won't let them in Annapolis. The Qing government say, forget it if that's the case, and we're going to pull the whole thing, call the whole thing off. But not before many of these young Chinese students learn to play baseball, learn to go to church, and in the horror of the Qing government, forget about the Chinese classics, at least so we were told, and start dating American women. And so there's a long history of romance, the word. But the stream of students that coming here and going elsewhere did not stop. It actually picked up even more by the turn of the 20th century. Most of them then went to Japan, but still many came to the United States. The Ching Dynasty itself failed in 1911, 1912. A republic was established, inheriting the multi-ethnic empire and trying to turn it into a centrally governed and directed nation state, proclaiming everyone who happened to be a part of the Qing Empire were now a member of the Chinese Republic. You're all now Chinese, as it were. Its effort was met with limited success for a whole number of reasons, and which I'm happy to go into a little bit more. And not that it didn't try hard, but it suffered from a lot of things. Let me go through a little bit of a laundry list for a moment. A weak central government. What the central government decreed, localities did not necessarily always follow. Gaping disparity between the rich and the poor, for that matter, between the rich coastal provinces and the poor interior. Mobilization of resources were poorly managed. Corruption, nepotism, lack of transparency in government, social discontent and unrest. Problem of establishing maybe a sound banking system, capital market, all of that. And I'm talking about, this is in the 20s and 30s. At the same time, there were also very visible pockets of the good life and progress. The city of Shanghai, for example, then as it is now, was a hub of innovation, energy, cosmopolitan place, crowded with the most entrepreneurial of the Chinese elites, American missionaries, Japanese businessmen, European adventurers, Russian refugees. By the 1930s, the Shanghai crowd was dancing to big band music, watching Hollywood movies, smoking American brand cigarettes, reading latest gossip about the escapades and tragedies of local film stars. It was called the Paris of the East End. They like to be called the New York of the East now. And if for some of you are familiar with China, been to Shanghai, or maybe follow the Chinese recent development, all of this might have a familiar ring to it. It is familiar because it is familiar. Let me perhaps make my concluding remarks by beginning with an anecdote. I think Ambassador Lily said, yes, last sentence is very Chinese. And makes me think about it, Is that really Chinese? Okay. Maybe it is. Who knows? Maybe it's in my blood. Who cares? And so, my father, who considered himself a very good Chinese patriot, came with me during one of my regular trips to China about 10 years ago. It was actually his first time back to the mainland after leaving the mainland in the 1940s. We met some old family members we haven't seen for a long, well, he hasn't seen for a long time, friends, some in government, some in business, so on. We talk about life in China today, other miscellaneous matters. Afterwards, my dad, who's not he's not a historian and he said to me rather matter-of-factly, and he said, did the communist government change anything? Because to him, he said, the problems, the trial of tribulations, the everyday life of our family and friends all seem so familiar to him. He has heard it all before. He said he claimed it. He claimed. He has seen it all before. I'm not sure how to answer that question, to be honest, and I'm not entirely sure how to answer that even now in front of you. Had the communist government changed anything? In some ways, one could certainly argue that the communist government changed many things since 1949 when it took power. Some for better, some, maybe not so good. But they try, some might say ruthlessly tried, to forge China from an empire into a nation. They tried different models, they tried different methods. Some of them will forever leave their mark in the annals of Chinese history, in the minds of the Chinese people. The great leap forward of the late 1950s, which ended up with maybe 20 million dead, the Cultural Revolution of the 1960s, the brutality, the unnecessary tearing apart of the social fabrics, and so on. But if you look at their record in the 50s, healthcare, literacy, combating certain problems, that plagued China for a long time, one could argue they did a good job. So, but the Great Leap and the Cultural Revolution, especially when you go to China today, even when you talk to the younger generation of Chinese people, boy, they look like distant history. I mean, they didn't The younger generation didn't know about it, didn't care about it. And in some way, as the late Chairman Mao once said during the Great Leap, that China will overtake Britain in 15 years, in the late 1950s. Well, it depends on which statistics you look at. China either already has a larger economy than Britain, or is poised to take over Britain sometime this year, or sometime very, very soon. So I guess that is a progress of a sort, if you look at it that way. And the world is a very different place. The Chinese central government, weakening as it might be, still had at its command a lot more resources than either the Qing or the Republican government. There's no immediate threat of the external war as it did in the Republican period. For that matter, no really viable alternative government, that are kind of challenging the regime. But still, it's sort of nagging me that for someone like my father, who had really literally kind of transposed in time from the 40s to the 90s, things did look, maybe still do look eerily similar or familiar. The overall question of how to transform a far-flung multi-ethnic empire into a governable nation-state and develop it quickly, when the entire polity, historically speaking, was always held together very precariously, even at the best of time, continued to be something of a challenge, to put it mildly. Although speaking as a historian, contrary to popular belief, most historians actually don't believe that history repeats itself. But whether China can survive these inevitable jolts and convulsion in this process, or for that matter, whether the world can survive it, well, the privilege of the historian is that I'll leave the questions for those wiser and more knowledgeable than I am to answer. Thank you.